So this is our agenda for tonight. So we have some awesome panelists. We have Tracy Carluccio from Delaware Riverkeeper Network, Dr. Robert Howarth from Cornell, Maya Van Rossum from Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and Karen Ferridan from Better Path Coalition. They're all going to tell you about themselves because they have great intros. So I think with that, I'm going to kick it over to Tracy.
Okay, thank you, Annika. Next slide, Peter. So good evening, everybody. Tonight we're going to talk about MACH2, which is the hydrogen hub that's planned for the Delaware River Watershed. To put this in context, the Biden administration has announced 7 hydrogen hubs. They're located across the nation, sharing $7 billion, and also another $100 billion in subsidies that hasn't been doled out yet. 5 of these hubs will use fossil gas to create what's called blue hydrogen, perpetuating fracking and fossil fuel development and infrastructure. And we're going to hear more about that from Dr. Howarth in the next part of the session tonight. The short of it is that these hubs will not decarbonize our energy systems, and they are not a climate solution as the Biden administration claims they are. They will actually become part of our climate problem. We'll hear from our panelists tonight why the hydrogen hubs are dangerous and polluting, inefficient, and cost prohibitive, and how they're going to result in enormous environmental and public health damage if they move ahead. And then instead, I want to make it really clear, we support truly clean, efficient, and renewable energy sources that do not release greenhouse gases. So next slide, please, Peter. So the Mid-Atlantic Hydrogen Hub was announced in October in Philadelphia by President Biden. $750 million has been earmarked, but one of the reasons we think we can actually defeat this MACH2 hub is because the money actually has not been given out yet. They have to jump through a bunch of hoops in order to get the money over the next year or more, and we think that we might be able to derail it. And we're going to work like hell to see that happens. Reportedly, there are 17 sites. They're located throughout the state of Delaware, southern New Jersey, and southeastern Pennsylvania, including the Delaware River region, which they define as along the I-95 corridor going up to Trenton, New Jersey. They will use nuclear, frac gas, hydropower, wind, and/or solar, according to the MACH2 abstract. And that's the only thing we have in writing, so we have to go by that. And that means they will employ what's called blue hydrogen. Again, Professor Howarth will elaborate on that. They will also, quote, reuse and revitalize significant existing pipeline infrastructure and terminals. This was one of their big selling points. Yes, there's a lot of pipelines, mainly as a legacy of the oil refinery days here in the Delaware River Watershed. They expect to have on build out a production of 300 plus tons of hydrogen and 100 each day, and 100,000 plus tons of hydrogen every year. And the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which is under the Department of Energy, that's supposed to be overlooking this hydrogen hub development, is making a big deal out of their community benefits plan. However, we don't know anybody in any community who's heard anything about a community benefits plan, and so there's been no transparency on this at all. Next slide, please, Peter. So a lot of the specifics about MACH2 are under wraps, but we have been ferreting out information, and we're going to share what we know tonight. We're actually going to have a series of webinars as we learn more. But right now, we know that the sources and the sites of production include the PBF refinery, which is the Delaware City refinery in Delaware. There's actually an existing gray hydrogen plant there now that PBF uses. But PBF, the MACH2 PBF say they want to build a new hydrogen plant, and they want it to be fueled by on-site solar, hydropower, wind, and nuclear. And they are planning a 600 ton per day output of hydrogen. Now, the wind power has been delayed because Ørsted has pulled out from building their wind facilities off the coast of New Jersey, and we don't know what that's going to be replaced with. South Jersey Industries was going to harness that for Mach 2. We just don't know what's going to happen with that, and that was their major green power claim to fame. The PSE&G Salem nuclear plant and Holtec modular nukes are going to be discussed by Maya Van Rossum a little later in the session tonight. And also orange hydrogen is used. Now that's where you pump carbon-rich water down into iron-rich rock formations and you extract out hydrogen. Sounds like fracking, doesn't it? Well, it does require injection wells. We're learning about that now. We don't know too much about how they would, we don't know anything about how they would do that here in Mach 2. And finally, there is an existing pilot hydrogen plant in Howell, New Jersey. It's been there for a couple years. It's run by New Jersey Resources. We're getting information about that plant. And finally, also, there is a mention of renewable natural gas as being a source of energy to produce hydrogen, and that would be using landfill gas, animal feeding operations, and wastewater. So the next thing that we would look at would be the connections or the distribution from the production to the end uses. And as I said, they're going to use pipelines. Now they say they're going to use existing or repurposed. We think they will probably be expanding and maybe making new ones. There will be compressors. And they also talk about transmission, including rail, air, ports, and what they call smart pipelines. And they're also very proud of what they call their hydrogen highway, which is supposed to be their hydrogen pipeline system that they end up delivering this hydrogen to. Next slide. So what we do know continued is the end uses. And basically they have plans for industrial, transportation, electric power generation, and residential and commercial end uses. So they do plan to burn it. They plan mega turbines. And we want to note that it's important that nitrogen oxide pollution will, from the burning of hydrogen, will be exposing frontline communities to an additional burden of devastating air pollution. Burning hydrogen produces 6 times the amount of nitrogen oxide than burning methane. So, and it's also a powerful greenhouse gas, and of course it's an ozone precursor, and we don't meet federal air standards because of our ozone conditions here in the Delaware River Valley. It's the last thing we need. Public transit, both in Delaware and Philadelphia, SEPTA and DART in Delaware, plan to fuel and burn hydrogen in vehicles. Also, they say they're going to build fueling stations along I-95 and truck fueling along the pipelines where they will have storage hubs in order to fill the trucks up and take it to other endpoints, perhaps out of our entire region. Chemical giants, DuPont and Croda in Delaware, say they want to use the hydrogen, and they're part of the Mach 2 partnership. Hilco is also a partner, and we don't know how Hilco will be involved. They don't say. It's the former PES refinery in Philadelphia. And we also know that Philadelphia Gas Works is a partner, but we don't know whether Hilco or PGW will be involved in the production, the storage, or will they be in end use? These details are, we can guess at, but we don't know. Also, they mentioned the Monroe refinery and the Paulsboro refinery, which is on the New Jersey side of the river, is owned by the same company, PBF, that owns the Delaware City refinery. They're mentioned. And then the former Eagle Point refinery, which is a little bit further north on the New Jersey side of the river, is also mentioned. So we also are keeping a really close eye on any applications for liquefaction because they can reduce the volume substantially of hydrogen like they do for LNG sort of, but to a much lower temperature by freezing the hydrogen. So that means they could transport it. It even means they could possibly export it. We have a lot of terminals that could be repurposed or that do exist in the Delaware River Watershed. Next slide, please, Peter. So I wanted you to see, some of the logos from the companies that are involved. A lot of these are that we're very familiar with. Some of them not so much, but also want to make it clear that the state of Delaware is a partner, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the city of Philadelphia, SEPTA, DART. And then there's universities and colleges, and they're going to get money, and they're also going to be partners, particularly in training programs and education for the MACH2 positions, and that's the University of Delaware, the Delaware State University, University of Pennsylvania, Cheyney University, Rowan University, and also other colleges as well. And these will all be involved in order to produce training. And then finally, the building trades in South Jersey, in Delaware, and in Pennsylvania are all involved, and they're in line to get millions upon millions of dollars for their training and apprenticeship programs. So that's a rundown on what we know. As I said, we'll be sharing more as we go along, and there'll be some links put into the chat as we go along. For instance, Delaware Riverkeeper Network has a web page where we have a lot of this information and links. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Robert Howarth of Cornell University, and he's going to discuss the greenhouse gas consequences of hydrogen. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you, Tracy, and I'm very pleased to be here to talk with you tonight about greenhouse gas consequences. I'm going to focus on blue hydrogen, but I'll give you some general background along the way. Next slide, please, Peter. So if we look at hydrogen now, 96% of all hydrogen globally is coming from fossil fuels. In China, it's mostly coming from coal, but in North America and Europe, it's virtually all coming from natural gas. And this is a process that was invented in the 1800s. It was perfected well over 100 years ago, and it's remained virtually unchanged over the last century. Natural gas is mostly methane, and methane is the feedstock for this chemical process. And the industry takes the natural gas, the methane and natural gas, puts it under high heat and pressure, adds a little bit of steam, and the methane breaks down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. We call that steam methane reforming. That heat and the pressure that are necessary for this and the generation of the steam are coming from burning more natural gas to provide heat and pressure. So there's a lot of natural gas involved in this. That's important to remember. And the product we call gray hydrogen. It's got a large greenhouse gas footprint. Next slide. So blue hydrogen is exactly the same thing, except there's some effort to capture some of that carbon dioxide that's created from the chemical breakdown of methane into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And this is a new term. It's a new concept. The term was first came around only 8 years ago. The French company Air Liquide came up with it. Since 2017, particularly since 2018, it's been heavily promoted by this group called the Hydrogen Council, which is 100% a product of big oil and gas. The original members of the Hydrogen Council are BP, Shell, Total, Exxon. These are, and their job is to try and sell blue hydrogen to the world. To date, only 2 companies have actually tried to produce this blue hydrogen, one plant in Texas and one in Alberta, and I'll show you some data from those in a minute. Next slide, please, Peter. A little bit of background first, though, on how this industry marketing campaign came about. We're increasingly seeing that carbon capture and storage, capturing carbon dioxide and permanently storing it, is one of the solutions, in quotes, that the oil and gas industry is throwing around. They're promoting it very, very heavily at COP28 this very moment. This has been attempted for decades for coal-burning power plants, literally going back to the 1970s, and the results simply are not impressive. It's extremely challenging to do. At best, they capture about 65% of the carbon dioxide. I say gross there in my slide because it takes energy to power that carbon dioxide capture. More fossil fuels are burned to provide that energy, putting out more emissions. And when you factor those in, the net capture rate, the actual reduction in total carbon dioxide released to the environment, is 35% or so when these plants are doing well. To date, no one's really attempted to do this for natural gas burning. I'll come back to that in a minute, but it's probably similar to what coal plants would do. But importantly, most of the natural gas that's used, certainly here in the northeastern US, but also in Europe and across Canada, most natural gas is used for heating of homes and commercial buildings. Not electricity production is less. And you can't, no one thinks you can have carbon capture in individual homes. It's clearly not feasible. Next slide, please. And so that's where this concept of blue hydrogen came in. And again, it's a recent creation from the marketers at Big Oil and Gas. The thought is that we take natural gas at a central plant, make it into hydrogen, do the carbon capture at that central plant, and then deliver hydrogen through pipelines to people's homes instead. So that's where the idea originates. And industry has highly promoted this as a nearly zero emission, sometimes a zero emissions technology, they say. This is from the Alberta company that's tried to do this. Next slide, please. Well, it turns out that the greenhouse gas footprint of this blue hydrogen is actually quite large. And Mark Jacobson, an engineer at Stanford, and I published a peer-reviewed paper on this back in the summer of 2021, not that long ago. One of the very, very few peer-reviewed analysis that looks at either gray or blue hydrogen. There are only two, before our paper is really only one other paper that ever looked at blue hydrogen. And ours was the first to include methane emissions and not simply look at carbon dioxide. That's important because when you're using that much natural gas, and again, you're using it as the chemical feedstock as well as the energy source, you can't develop and use natural gas without having some methane emitted even before you get to the plant. It's fundamentally from drilling, fracking, transporting, processing gas, you're going to have some methane leak to the environment. And methane's an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas. Next slide, please. So our analysis is actually very straightforward. We have just four major input parameters. One is what that methane emission rate is from using and developing natural gas. And we say 3.5% of it's emitted. But we know there's uncertainty around that. So we do an analysis at what we think are the lowest and highest reasonable rates. If you're going to compare methane to carbon dioxide, you have to do so over a defined time period. And we use 20 years, which I think the science strongly supports, but not everyone agrees with that. So we look at other alternatives as well. We look at the capture rate, how much of that carbon dioxide is really captured in the steam methane reforming. And we assume it's 85%, which is what the two plants, a little bit better than the two plants that have tried it so far did. Our sensitivity analysis went down to 79%, which is what they really did, and up to 90%, which is what they claim they ought to be able to do. And then we looked at the carbon dioxide capture from the gas that's burned to provide the heat and pressure and all. So far, no one's tried to do that, so 0%. But we say it could be up to 65% based on what the coal plants have done. Next slide. So those are the input assumptions, and these are our primary results. We're looking at the greenhouse gas emissions here per energy produced from different fuels. We're looking at fossil fuels on the right-hand side and hydrogen on the left, and we're looking both at the direct emissions of carbon dioxide there in yellow, and in red are the methane emissions converted to carbon dioxide equivalencies. And the take-home point is that when you look at gray hydrogen, the traditional hydrogen that's been made for 130, 140 years, and then move to blue hydrogen, the next bar over, blue hydrogen has a slightly reduced greenhouse gas footprint compared to gray hydrogen, but not by much. Those carbon dioxide emissions are lower, but they go nowhere near zero. And the methane emissions are higher because you're using more natural gas to power this whole thing. And again, there are methane emissions associated with that. And then if we compare with natural gas, diesel, oil, or coal, this blue hydrogen has a larger greenhouse gas footprint than any fossil fuel. You're better off simply burning natural gas if that's your goal in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. That slide I just showed you was for the attempt where they were not trying to capture the carbon dioxide from the energy used to power the steam methane reforming. Here, I've included a second bar a little bit to the right there, where we show what happens if you do try to capture that carbon dioxide emissions as well. And the carbon dioxide emissions go down a little bit more, but the methane emissions go up because, again, it takes more energy. You end up actually burning more natural gas to do this. And overall, there's no net decrease in the overall greenhouse gas footprint. Next slide. I just want to highlight for those of you who don't think much about methane, that methane really is an incredibly important part of the climate system we need to get under control. And this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 2021. On the left, we're looking at the net warming of the planet so far from pre-industrial baseline. It's about 1 degree. The next bar is the total of the greenhouse gases that are contributing to that, and it would take it up to about 1.5. We haven't warmed the planet quite that much because some substances, sulfur gases in particular, act to cool the planet. And so the net has only been about 1.1 as of a few years ago. It's warmer now. But when you look at the next bar over and compare carbon dioxide and methane, carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas, but methane is a close second. And in fact, methane is responsible for about 1/3 of all of the global warming that has happened since the end of the 1800s. So it's really important. Next slide. And that's what that says. Next slide, please. So again, our analysis is very simple. It's actually very conservative, but we did a sensitivity analysis as well. Next slide. I'm just going to summarize that for you. So this is a busy little table, but we're looking at the numbers for emissions for gray hydrogen compared to blue hydrogen, either with or without capturing the emissions from burning the natural gas, and then compared to natural gas on the right. And that top bar, I'm just showing you the baseline analysis that I showed you in the figure a moment ago, 3.5% methane emissions with a global warming analysis over a 20-year time period. The next red bar I'm highlighting down there is sort of our worst case scenario. Methane emissions are higher, and we're looking at a higher aspect of comparing carbon dioxide to methane based on what the literature allows, but it's at the high end of what would it allow. Take-home conclusion is the same. All of the emission numbers are higher because of those changes. They go up across the board. Bottom line is blue hydrogen is still not much better than gray hydrogen, and it's still far worse than just burning natural gas. And then the best case is if we go down to a very optimistic, I think unbelievably low estimate for methane emissions of 1.54%, and we look at methane compared to carbon dioxide over a 100-year time period, which is undervalues the true damage done by methane. All of the emissions go down, but the fundamental conclusions are still the same. Blue hydrogen in this case is still not that much better than gray hydrogen, and it's about the same as natural gas. Maybe no worse than, but it's no better than either. There's no reason to be making blue hydrogen. Next slide. I'll skip over that. I just, in the interest of time, move on to the next slide. I'm quite confident in our methane emissions number, but I wanted to just highlight this because, of course, the oil and gas industry hated our paper, and social media was alive for months. There was going to be a reply coming out proving we're wrong. That was finally published in March of 2022, and it's a bunch of people with close ties to the oil and gas industry, and basically they said they had a couple of criticisms, but one was we use real world data for efficiencies of carbon dioxide capture, and they said we should instead use what industry models it might be able to do in the future, although they've never been able to do. So I said, well, okay, believe that if you like, I don't. But the other is they said our estimates for methane emissions were too high. And in fact, the only source they provided in their paper, which indicated methane emissions lower than we used in our sensitivity analysis, is shown in this little figure here. It's just a cartoon. It's a cartoon from an industry website. This is all that's on the page from that whole industry website. There's no links to any data whatsoever. It simply says that industry is doing better and methane emissions are low, and therefore we're wrong. So whatever. Next slide, please. Irritating beyond belief. I just want to make one other point. Our analysis gave low estimates for the greenhouse gas footprint of hydrogen in that we did not look at the role of hydrogen directly itself. At the time, we weren't really thinking very heavily about that. There's been a lot of science in the time that our paper came out, which is only in the last 28 months. But even though hydrogen itself is not a greenhouse gas, putting hydrogen into the atmosphere does increase global warming because it affects other greenhouse gases, particularly methane. It makes methane hang around in the atmosphere longer, creates more ozone, it puts more water vapor into the stratosphere, which warms the planet as well. So we didn't include that. Things are worse than we thought. And by the way, if you think methane emissions and leaks are bad, hydrogen is far worse. It's a smaller molecule. It's the smallest molecule in the universe. It's very slippery, very leaky, very hard to contain. It will leak. Next slide. Just one or two more points blue hydrogen's terrible from a climate perspective. I hope you have been convinced of that. I want to point out that in the past, hydrogen's use has been almost entirely as a chemical feedstock and not really as a fuel. And progressive energy planners have been talking for the last decade or so about a role for hydrogen in an energy future for uses which are really hard to decarbonize, things like making steel or maybe air travel. They're talking about green hydrogen, and that's the hydrogen which is made from renewable electricity to electrolyze water and break down water into hydrogen and oxygen with no carbon dioxide involved. So this whole idea of blue hydrogen, again, it's a new creation of oil and gas. I hope we're killing the idea. They paid a little bit of attention when our paper came out in 2021, and one response in the fall was to drop the blue hydrogen language, and they started talking about clean hydrogen and clean energy, confusing green and blue hydrogen. And you see that throughout the hydrogen hub planning that's been going on. Next slide. So blue hydrogen should have no future at all in our energy future. What about green hydrogen? And even here, I think green hydrogen's been wildly overhyped. It's been carried along by the marketing folks at big oil and gas. And so I think there is a role for green hydrogen, but it's much less than many people have suggested. And I want to make sure that you understand that we should never use hydrogen of any sort for heating homes and buildings, which is still being promoted by the oil and gas industry. There are a variety of reasons for doing that. It's unsafe, it's untested, but on top of that, it's also extremely inefficient. And so the take-home message is renewable electricity is a hugely scarce, precious resource when we're trying to decarbonize our energy over the next decade or three. If we use electricity directly to heat homes with high efficiency heat pumps, you get 3 to 4 to 5 times more heat energy out of that than you're putting in from the renewable electricity. If you're to take the same amount of renewable electricity and make hydrogen and transport that to the home and burn it for energy, you're losing half of the energy. So the efficiencies are hugely different. Bottom line is using electricity directly for heating gives you 6 to 10 times more heat energy in your home than if you play around with hydrogen and all of the danger that's involved in that. Next slide, actually skip, well, next slide. I said most of that. Next slide, please. That's just a lot of detail. That's the fundamental message I wanted to leave you. There's a lot of other details to why we shouldn't be putting hydrogen into gas pipelines. We can talk about that at the end. And we're going to hold off on all questions to the end. So if you have them, put them in the Q&A, and I and others will try and answer them as we have time. Hopefully we'll have time. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Maya. So, Maya, all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Howarth. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all that really helpful information and dispelling a lot of the myths that the MACH2 Hydrogen Hub folks have been proposing or advancing. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the direct nuclear footprint of the proposed MACH2 Hydrogen Hub, which mainly is going to come from the Salem Nuclear Generating Station, but there may be other elements. But Peter, next slide. First, people want to know what pink hydrogen is. I have hot pink slides. I'm sure that woke you up. It's intended to, because it's scary stuff. So what pink hydrogen is where the breaking down of the molecules in order to create the hydrogen is generated through power that comes from nuclear energy. Next slide, please. According to the information that was provided at the MACH2 briefing on October 25th, they asserted that the only power, and I saw this in the comments or in the chat earlier, they asserted that the only power sources that were going to be used for the hydrogen hub at MACH2 was green, pink, and orange. They ignored the fact that their own documentation and paperwork, as Tracy said right up at the beginning, that made clear that actually natural gas is going to be involved in this. But just taking their graphic from their October 25th presentation, we can see that at least about 1/5, 20% of the energy is going to come from nuclear sources for the MACH2 hydrogen hub, according to the figures that they've been putting out. Next slide, please. So when we think about where is this nuclear energy going to come from and what is going to be the footprint of that nuclear energy here in our Delaware River Basin, here in our Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware region, there are two sources that the MACH2 folks have talked about. First and foremost, PSE&G is involved, and they specifically talk about the Salem Nuclear Generating Station. The Salem Nuclear Generating Station is located on Artificial Island in Lower Alloways Creek Township in Salem County, New Jersey. This is a facility that has been around since the 1970s, and it has a very significant environmental footprint, which we'll get to in a second. But this is going to very definitely be a significant source of the nuclear power that would fuel the MACH2 hydrogen hub. The next source of hydrogen that they talk about or primarily focus on in their materials is the construction of what they call our small module reactors that are going to be manufactured and installed around the region. Exactly where, we don't really know. That's yet to be seen. But I did actually get a call today from a reporter asking about the proposal from Holtec International, which is the partner in the MACH2 hub that would be primarily responsible for this, as we understand it. Holtec is actually proposing the construction of one of these small modular reactors at the old Oyster Creek nuclear power plant site. That's actually a site that's located in Ocean County, New Jersey. The Oyster Creek nuclear power plant was shut down, to the great relief of so many in the region, in 2018. And now it looks like Holtec is actually targeting that site for one of these modular reactors that would be part of the MACH2 hydrogen hub. I'm sure that that's going to be very, very concerning for the surrounding community members to learn. It's certainly very concerning for the Delaware Riverkeeper Network to learn. Next slide, please. When we think about Salem and what are going to be the footprint impacts of the Salem Nuclear Generating Station, the primary impacts are the fish kills at Salem. Because Salem was constructed and has been allowed for decades to continue to operate with outdated technology, it has an outsized footprint on the aquatic life in the Delaware River and estuary. And in fact, at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, the way we characterize it, and this is true, if you look at all the numbers, the Salem Nuclear Generating Station is the largest predator in Delaware Bay when it comes to aquatic life. Salem, the footprint, the harms that it inflicts on aquatic life outsizes any other source of take for aquatic life in the Delaware River and the Delaware estuary. In fact, the Salem Nuclear Generating Station kills over 14 billion with a B, fish, eggs, and larvae every single year. It's a massive footprint. Salem Nuclear Generating Station also discharges superheated water into the Delaware estuary ecosystem. So it heats up the water around that discharge, and that has significant ecological impacts. There are some pollution discharges that come from the facility, and nuclear waste is, of course, generated at the Salem Nuclear Power Plant. And that waste, as far as we know, is stored on site, either in pools at the facility, or they have some outside of the pools on the land storage operations that are part of the Salem Nuclear Power Plant compound. This waste is being stored there. It's being built up. Something has to happen to it eventually, right? And in fact, what we know through other activities of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and partner organizations is that Holtec, the very same Holtec that's part of MACH2, has been working very, very hard to get the approvals necessary to ship, truck, train, transport nuclear waste from all over the United States of America to Southeast New Mexico in order to store it in canisters that are placed underground at a site in Southeast New Mexico near frontline communities, near indigenous communities, near environmental justice communities who very much do not want to be the recipient of the nuclear waste from the Salem nuclear generating stations or facilities all over the nation. So Holtec is a bad actor here. Holtec is a bad actor there. As nuclear waste builds up at Salem or at any of these other operations, even these modular sites, it's got to go somewhere. Holtec is looking to take it to the people in New Mexico. Next slide, please. And the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, as so many others, are 100% opposed to that. One of the things to know about Salem and this footprint, through the construction and the operation of MACH2, if that were to happen, and we believe it will not, we believe that we will defeat it. But if it were to happen, it is going to extend the footprint of harm at the Salem nuclear generating station, because it is very likely going to extend the life of the Salem nuclear generating station. Actually, the two parts of the generating stations, units 1 and units 2, should have already shut down. They originally were supposed to be shut down in 2016 and 2020. In the year 2011, they got a 20-year life extension. They're now proposed for shutdown in 2036, 2040. If this hydrogen hub were to advance, we are sure that the Salem nuclear generating station would get a massive new life extension. So this 14 billion Delaware River fish eggs and larvae that are killed every year, the superheated water, the creation of nuclear waste that has to go somewhere, all of that is going to expand and continue well into the future if MACH2 is allowed to happen. Next slide, please. And the next slide is for me to pass it on to Karen Faraday with the Better Path Coalition.
Thanks, Maya. So we've heard about green hydrogen already a bit tonight here and there, and I just wanted to kind of look at it overall, look at all the various problems with it. But to start, I just wanted to talk about like the 3 E's. So it's green hydrogen that is produced from electricity when the electricity comes from renewables and not from coal or gas. So the electricity has to be coming from renewable resources for the green hydrogen to be truly considered green. And that's not always the case. Sometimes it kind of gets just lumped in. And so it's important to understand where the source is and to really try to grapple with the fact that it's not always easy to understand where the source is. So that's the first E. So the electricity is used, the current of the electricity is used in a process called electrolysis. And so that's the process that splits H2 and O. It splits the hydrogen molecules into its respective parts and creates as a result pure hydrogen. And that is done with an apparatus that's called an electrolyzer. And so the electrolyzer comes into play in a little bit. So as I go through the list, I'll bring that term up again. But those are the 3 E's. And so when I look at the list here, you can kind of see how things are grouped. The first 3 I put under the umbrella that it's still hydrogen. So green hydrogen is still a tiny molecule, regardless of what color of the hydrogen rainbow hydrogen comes from. It's still hydrogen, and so it's a tiny molecule. It's prone to leaking. It's highly volatile and flammable, and its global warming potential, as you heard from Dr. Howarth, is many times that of carbon dioxide. It's 11 times plus change. So it's a very powerful. It has a very powerful global warming potential, even though it's not a carbon source. It's an indirect influencer. It's clean, but it's not cleaner. It's not clean, I should say. So it is still producing NOx emissions from burning hydrogen. Those are NOx emissions that are significantly higher than from burning methane. And so that's another downside, that there are still NOx emissions. It's not an absolutely clean process. No carbon, but other pollutants are involved. And then number 5, it doesn't exist. And for this, I have a quote I wanted to read from something Naomi Oreskes wrote last year for the August issue of Scientific American, and I can put the link into the chat later on. But she wrote, "Imagine if I had planned to build a home with materials that had not yet been invented, or build a civilization on Mars without first figuring out how to get even one human being there. you'd likely consider me irrational, perhaps delusional. Yet this is the kind of thinking that pervades plans for future decarbonization. And so that's really the point, is that, these things don't quite exist, certainly not in a scalable fashion. And so the one bit of information that I wanted to provide here is a quote that says in 2022, less than 0.1% of global hydrogen was produced this way from, in carbon-free sense, according to the International Energy Agency's press office. However, that figure also includes electrolysis from nuclear, and that means that the actual share of green hydrogen coming from renewable electricity is likely to be microscopic. And so we're putting a lot of our chips in a basket that we should not be doing, because we don't even know how possible this is. And if it's possible probably a long way off. And so if you can go to the next slide, Peter. There are other problems with it. It's very water intensive. Throughout its life cycle, each megawatt hour of green hydrogen consumes at least 5,000 liters of water. Compare that to solar, which uses 20 liters per megawatt hour, or wind, which uses just 1 liter per megawatt hour. Production could deplete water supplies in drought-stricken areas. And so that's something that is very important to keep in mind. But it's also very renewable energy intensive. And so according to the European Commission estimates, they estimate that 500 terawatt hours of additional green electricity will be needed to reach the EU's, now this was the EU report that just came out, but it will be needed to reach the EU's 2030 domestic production goal of 10 million tons of green hydrogen. And that is more than all of the electricity that was consumed in France or Germany in 2022. And it's also more than all of the wind power generated by electricity, and nearly 2.5 times all electricity from solar power produced in the whole European Union that same year. So we're talking about these, requirements that are extraordinary. And I bring that up because when you look at what we heard actually in a hearing that was held yesterday, hearing from someone in the renewable energy sector, he was talking about how improbable it is that we could ever have enough renewable energy in place quickly to be able to even consider green hydrogen. What happens right now is that, Pennsylvania lags behind the rest of the country overall in renewables, but with respect to renewable electricity, we have 3% roughly made from renewables. New Jersey has 2% and Delaware has 1%. And these are all figures from 2021. And so we're not really producing anywhere near the amount of renewable electricity that we would need to even power green hydrogen in the first place. And so it's a distant, idea that is maybe going to have some implications for, cleaning up the hard to abate sectors someday, maybe. But right now we're nowhere near even making this a reality, and to base an entire hub on it, it just doesn't make any sense. I also like to point out always, every chance I get, that it's a bait and switch, or bait and never switch, I call it, that gives the fossil fuel industry cover to build more fossil fuel infrastructure. So there's this promise that we're going to build pipelines now, but they're going to be used for clean hydrogen down the road. And then the other one is the bait and switch, or bait and never switch again, that gives the fossil fuel industry cover to deploy blue hydrogen. And that one we have heard already as well, that we're going to start blue because, we've got to bring down that cost of green, but then we're going to switch to green. Well, if you're in this part of the world, that's never going to happen. If it's blue, it's going to stay blue. And that's the point. And that's who's driving this very industry that wants to be able to keep doing business as usual. And so it's not going to turn green. And then I just wanted to also close with the fact that it's diverting billions that should be going into deploying renewables. And so we need renewables in their own right to provide renewable energy, not just power hydrogen. We need renewables now. And one of the things that's very disconcerting about this enthusiasm for a hydrogen economy overall, green included, is that it's really something that's not being done hand in hand with deploying renewables, but really in place of deploying renewables. And that is doing us a huge disservice. And so I just wanted to close with that point and then turn it over to Annika.
Thanks, Karen. So after all of that great stuff, we are going to move on to some questions, and I've got a lot of them, which is great. And just real quick is, yeah, we'll have the recording available afterwards and any information too. So I'm going to start with a question that Maya kind of addressed, but maybe Karen, Tracy, you want to talk about it, is this idea that everybody who seemed to get info from the DOE that MACH2 was going to be all green or totally no fossil fuels. So people seem to wonder why we're talking about fossil fuels in MACH2.
Well, the original abstract that was given to the federal government as their application for the MACH2 being included in the chosen hubs says that they're going to use blue hydrogen. It says they're going to use natural gas. There are other places that this has been said, particularly by the building trades in various contexts, but it's clear that they have said sort of what Karen said as well, which is that while we develop our renewable resources, we're going to use blue hydrogen. But they also say they're going to use it as part of the permanent thing. Now, there has been, Maya mentioned the briefing that was held in October, and Colin O'Mara, who is the chairman of the MACH2, made a lot of statements about how this was going to be green. That was before Ørsted pulled out. So we don't know. And he said he was going to supply a new abstract, which said that blue hydrogen was not going to be used at all. And we have never seen that. We have filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the Department of Energy to get it. We have never seen it. So we have to go by what the public has in hand, which is the written document, which is the abstract and the application from the MACH2 partners to the Department of Energy.
Cool. Okay. This one, I'll turn this one over to Dr. Howarth. Ken asks, what is the true potential for H2 to slow climate change?
Well, you know, I think, as I said, I think hydrogen's being overhyped as a solution to climate change. So there are some places where we talk about hard to decarbonize industries and processes where hydrogen may play a role. But those are few and far between. Cement manufacturing, perhaps, but there are other ways to go. Steel manufacturing is a one that's usually held up as a place where we could use hydrogen. But I'd point out that in the last few years, steel is being made commercially in Sweden by a company that's using mostly electricity, renewable electricity, generating huge heat, and they're using a tiny amount of hydrogen as a chemical agent in it, as opposed to the energy source, and doing so with far more efficiencies. So, you know, my personal view is that we can get 95% of where we need to go to live in a decarbonized future, zero fossil fuels. We can get 95% of the way there without relying on hydrogen at all. Now, can hydrogen be used to store solar power when there's a surplus, or when there's a surplus of wind power? Can hydrogen be used to store that? And clearly it can, and it may be that it'll have a big use that way, but there are a lot of competing technologies. I was just reading today a new paper about a battery technology that uses seawater and conventional lead acetate batteries, and instead of producing hydrogen from offshore wind turbines, captures it in this chemical energy form that they can then feed back into the grid at later times. And the efficiencies are far, far higher than for hydrogen. So I think it's really unfortunate that hydrogen has gotten tied up in the marketing campaigns of big oil and gas, but it has. And it's outstripped where the science is really going to take us. And I think society should step back and rethink this with a skeptical eye.
Awesome. So I have another one that I think, Karen, if I'm wrong, I think you can answer this one, is up your alley. What are the technical problems with electrolysis, other than the fact that electrolysis takes a lot of power and costs a whole lot to take place?
Probably Dr. Howarth could do a better job of this, but one of the problems is, and I didn't even go into it, I said I'd come back to the term, and I'm bringing it up now, is that idea of the electrolyzer. And so the electrolyzer is the apparatus. They have this concept to talk about load factor. Again, when we're producing at the level of like 3%, 1%, 2% of our electricity in the renewable sense, the idea that we're even talking about load factor is kind of preposterous, because it has to do with the efficiency of the electrolyzer to keep producing at a level that would allow, the renewables to be produced in such a way that it could actually power this process well. And I mean, again, we're nowhere close to that, but even down the line, that kind of thing is a concern when you're talking about this idea that they would like to source the renewable energy locally. And that, according to the various things I've read, and Dr. Howarth should correct me if I'm wrong about this, but according to the various things that I've read, it seems like that's kind of a pipe dream, no pun intended, but that, that it would be difficult to produce using local sources only, or even local utilities, enough renewable energy at specific sources to be able to do this process well. And so makes it even more sort of improbable. But again, Dr. Howarth is the expert here, so I defer to you.
No, I think you have it exactly right. Well done.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of combine two questions that I think everybody might have something to say. There is a question for Dr. Howarth, how your work has been received by policy and government, and then I'm gonna combine that with kind of how are we reacting to political pressure. So I think that one's also open to anybody on political pressure for hydrogen to, be the charging forward energy pathway.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And, I think I first learned of blue hydrogen because I sit on this commission in the state of New York to renewable energy. I'm part of the group that's charged with developing the blueprint for meeting climate goals. And the oil and gas industry came to us and said blue hydrogen is the key. Well, in New York, we've rejected that totally, and no, we're going all electrification and heat pumps, and we rejected it. So at least in my own state, our research has been well received. In the United Kingdom, our paper came out the week that the United Kingdom was coming up with this big energy plan for the future, and it had a huge role for blue hydrogen. And there are an awful lot of politicians in the United Kingdom who thought that we published our paper on purpose to disrupt their political careers at that time. I wish I had that kind of control over when my papers are published, but we didn't. Pure coincidence. I would point out, though, that the head of the lobbying group for hydrogen for the UK as a whole resigned the week after our paper came out, basically saying we're right, and he was done with it. And the UK has backed away largely from hydrogen, not entirely, but at this point, we're seeing more push in the US than we are in the UK. The EU similarly has backed away. So I think it's not just our paper, it's the fact that our paper it's the first of several that are starting to look at it, and the picture is pretty clear and compelling. But it's the Biden administration, unfortunately, I think was on this roll already, and the IRA got carried away with Senator Manchin's input. They needed to buy into it, and he wanted blue hydrogen in there as part of it, and they've gone along with it. But I'm optimistic that in 5 to 10 years, no one will be talking about blue hydrogen.
I would just add about politics and sort of our strategic thinking going forward. One of the things that we're doing is gathering information, and we're working in coalition with other groups at sharing information. We think this is very important. Also, we have members that get in touch with us when they see something suspicious going on that could be, the toe in the door of some sort of hydrogen project, because this has happened both in Pennsylvania and Delaware, and only because people have found out about it was it able to be stopped, because they're running ahead. So one of the things that we want to do is, as an action after this webinar, is put together a sign-on letter, and we'll send it to everybody who is a registrant and to others as well, individuals and organizations, to send into the Department of Energy expressing our concerns about MACH2, going over the lack of transparency, these community development plans that don't exist, but they're making such a big deal out of, and all of the environmental issues that we've touched on here tonight. So look for that sign-on letter. We think it's important for us to speak directly to those who are making this decision at the Department of Energy, and and to make it very clear that you know, even the Office of Clean Energy demonstrations needs to hear from those people who are going to be affected by this, because we're the ones that are going to pay the price of these projects being built. It's a big bunch of tentacles going out across the Delaware River watershed, and we're not going to let this happen. So we'll fight it, and we can start out by speaking up. So look for that letter. It'll be our first action, and we'll go from there and develop a strategy as we learn more.
And so I just want to add, you know, we're really appreciative of everybody coming. As you can see, we're trying to bring together a lot of the threads of impact. Many people wouldn't think about the fish kills at Salem when they're thinking about the hydrogen hub, right? But it's all connected. And so there are so many facets of harm. We're trying to pull that together. We're happy to see in the comments that people appreciate that we're putting this information out in bite-sized pieces. And the only final thing I just want to say is we have to take everything that Colin O'Mara, the politicians, the regulatory agencies are putting out there when it comes to this hydrogen hub. There seems to be a different story coming out of everybody's mouth. What we read in the documentation is different than what Colin O'Mara professes, which is different than what the politicians are saying. So they're not all on the same page. They're all just trying to pitch a poison to us, and hope that we will blindly follow them and support this. They talk about transparency and having engaged all community voices. When you actually look at the voices that they've engaged, it's those who are going to make money off of this, whether they're going to make money because there's going to be, you know, direct money for them, for their companies and their operations, or they're going to make money because they've worked, sorry, Dr. Howarth, for an academic, college or university that's getting some sort of grant that seems to be backing this up, right? They're not all like you know, really solid in your independence and your research. So it's really going to be up to we, the people. If they don't want to invite our voices in, we've got to make our voices heard. And that's what tonight is a piece of hoping that we help to accomplish. So we really appreciate you all joining. We hope that you'll sign on to that sign-on letter. We hope that you'll read all of the materials that we've put in the chat and that you'll stay engaged with us, because only by working together are we going to be victorious. We beat fracking, we can beat hydrogen.
Sharon, did you want to add anything before we close out?
Just one real quick comment I just wanted to make, because I know a lot of you were on that OCED, was it webinar about the hub, and they didn't answer a lot of questions. That's why we're having to do all of this. And so what we had done, a bunch of us, it turns out, at the various ones across the country, we had copied and pasted Q&A. And so we have all the questions that were asked that weren't answered. And of the 4 that we've already collected, it's over 650 questions. And so we're sending them to the Department of Energy and saying, we'd like answers now. And so if you still have any answers, I can put my email into the chat, send them along. I'll include them in the questions that we sent to the DOE. So if something didn't occur to you that night, I'll put my info in the chat right now. Thanks.
Great.
Bob, did you have anything last minute before we close off? Annika's going to close
No,
out.
I'm just very, very pleased to be part of this tonight, and I wish you luck in opposing this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So with that, we're going to close. Thanks for all the great questions. Thank you all for coming. We have a slide with, become a Delaware River Keeper Network member, stay up to date, stay informed. We're going to have lots of important webinars on this topic to come. And thank you all. And you'll get an email with the recording and important information and links in the following days. So keep an eye out for that.
Thank you, everybody.